we did a number of sort of conceptual discussions very early on when we talked about French colonization, and we need to do another one right now to sort of really understand what's going on in Canada's history with its Indigenous people. And that's really, really important because in a lot of ways, this is an idea that is not often explicitly expressed. This isn't often something that someone's going to say out loud. Although, again, we've got some exceptions. We'll read some stuff from Duncan Scott, and we'll sort of have that conversation about what this looks like explicitly. Um, but there is that sort of, this is an underlying idea that runs through a lot of expectations and assumptions that are made about Indigenous experiences and Indigenous sort of Canadians in general. And that's the idea that is referred to as ethnocentrism. And this is an idea that essentially an individual might believe that their beliefs, values, culture, all of that sort of stuff is superior to those of other groups. Okay? When we talk about ethnocentrism, we have two different kinds of it, right? There's a form of ethnocentrism that is often referred to as passive ethnocentrism. And passive ethnocentrism is sort of a way of saying, you know what? I like my way of doing things best. And I think that my way is probably the better one, and I like it better. But for the most part, I'm just going to let other people do what they're going to do. And that kind of ethnocentrism might be problematic from sort of a conceptual or a learning level. But at a policy level, it doesn't really become an issue because it just means that people are going to say, hey, we should do things this way that I like, the way that works for my cultural background. But we also have an active form of ethnocentrism. And that active form of ethnocentrism is essentially, and those of you who know anything about residential schools will probably find this fairly familiar. There's an idea that because my way of doing things is superior, or at least I believe it is, what I need to do is to convince you to also adopt my way of being and my belief. And that has a lot of policy consequences, a lot of which we will talk about in the context of sort of Canadian history. But it includes all kinds of things. Many of the policies that are labeled assimilationist are examples of ethnocentrism at work, in that assimilationist policies are policies that actively attempt to assimilate groups of people who have different cultural beliefs and different sort of cultural histories. But for those of you who are familiar, who have heard policies or decisions called paternalistic, sort of unnecessarily infantilizing people, those policies in a lot of ways are also ethnocentric because they come from an assumption that the people you're talking about, or in this case that sort of means Canada's Indigenous people, are not sufficiently mature enough to make their own decisions. Paternalistic comes from the sort of root about sort of talking about fatherhood, and in that sort of sense, like, it's a word that we use to make decisions for children, right? I have a young child at home, and I don't let her choose to go to bed. I don't let her choose when she wants to go when she goes to bed, because if I do that, she's going to make an irresponsible decision. And we accept that when we're talking about parents making decisions, at least for their very young children, and at least some of those decisions. But that's a much more difficult proposition to sort of present from the position of, I'm an adult, you're an adult, both of us are in full possession of our mental faculties, but I am going to make decisions for you that assume you are not capable of making those decisions for yourself. That is driven by ideas about ethnocentrism. And the reason that we say that is because those ideas, that assumption that I can make decisions for you in this sort of context, are driven by an assumption that whatever my beliefs, practices, ideas, whatever those things are superior to anyone else's. And that is a difficult sort of piece to sort of get to. Mostly because when we're talking about ethnocentrism, we very, very rarely specify the standards that we're using, right? So if we wanted to talk about the Human Development Index, for example, the UN's Human Development Index, for example, makes lots and lots of comparisons between countries about quality of life. that's not necessarily an ethnocentric standard, because if you want to know what makes a country better on that quality of life index, the UN can tell you. They can sort of say, well, we look at the number of people who can read, we look at the life expectancy at birth, we look at the rates of infant mortality, we look at economic inequality, and we sort of make a calculation based on all of that, and here's the formula. So, in terms of explicit standards, that's not necessarily an ethnocentric set of standards. But on the other hand, remember our discussion about privileging permanent settlements and written culture, right? If you have a culture that is primarily oral, right? A culture that privileges oral traditions or keeps its history in other ways rather than writing them down, then you're fundamentally disadvantaged, and your society is going to look backwards, or otherwise sort of disadvantaged, because the rate, when you sort of look at things like literacy rates, if we do that assuming written language rather than sort of a degree of fluency with your own language and the ability to communicate, which is a much more complicated thing to measure, you sort of created that assumption of a standard that written culture is what is necessary today. The UN generally justifies that because they sort of talk about participation in a global economy. But I want to give that as an example so that you have an understanding that sometimes ethnocentrism is built into a lot of the things that we sort of take for granted, right? I don't think many of you would sit here and argue that literacy is a bad thing. Um, and it's not necessarily, but it does get more complicated than that when we sort of start talking about what qualifies a society as advanced or developed in that sort of context. So that's an idea that runs through a lot of our sort of policies, in that, aside from anything else, there are a lot of policies that get enacted in Canada's history with its Indigenous people that simply don't make sense if you don't underlie them with these sort of implicit and really taken for granted ideas about ethnocentrism, and ideas that say, oh no, European cultures are superior to cultures that are indigenous to North America. Okay?